Welcome, everyone, to another edition of Wildcard Wednesday. It is July 8th, and I am Stacy Buck, President and Senior Consultant at RadRx. So last week, I did not have an episode. I actually was working on a special project that took me a bit of time, so I missed last week's episode. But this week, I am going to go through 3 cases that were sent in. So let's jump right in and take a look at the first one. So on these cases that were sent to me, I've included the questions that were asked when the op notes were sent in. So this first case that we have here to look at, the person who sent the report in made a note that the ordering note was showing angiogram and the need for possible intervention. So that information was provided in addition to the actual text of the report. And then the question asked was about the codes that were assigned, specifically about the distal SMA branch and how that should be coded, whether it should be, 36246 instead of 36245. So that was the main question. So with that said, let's jump in and take a look at what we have here. So this is a procedure that's relatively straightforward. We see 4 steps in our procedure list. We see our access, we see cath and angiography of the SMA, and then we see that revascularization was performed with stent placement, and then that was the end of the procedure. So if we look here, at the clinical history, it doesn't say anything about the need for diagnostic angiography, but again, the person who sent in the note said that the other documentation said possible intervention. So based on that, I would say that we can go ahead and code for the diagnostic angiography. However, we're going to have a different problem in this case where I'm going to say we're not going to code the angiography. So let's go ahead and jump into it and see what we have. So our procedure starts out with access in that right common femoral artery, and then that's done under ultrasound guidance. And so we have our documentation present for that. So we're going to assign 76937. Then from there, the catheter was moved into the abdominal aorta. And so at that point, we would have a 36200 for that catheterization. But then the catheter is going to move further, so that catheterization of the aorta is going to end up being bundled. So the aorta was selected, and then we see that it says that we have a sheath was upsized to a 6.5 French, tour guide. The sheath was brought to the origin of the superior mesenteric artery. So not catheter, it's a sheath, and it says brought to the origin of. So there's a question there. Where is the catheter, exactly, or even where's the sheath? Are we right before the origin? Are we in the origin? There's a question there. And it mentions angiography was performed in multiple obliques here. So the problem with this statement is that we don't have specific mention of the catheter going into the superior mesenteric artery for imaging. In order to assign that code 75726, that code represents selective angiography. So we would need to know that the catheter was actually in the superior mesenteric artery in order to assign 75726. So although the statement was possible angiogram, which would allow us to report the imaging, the actual documentation itself falls short. Now, it is possible that imaging was performed from a injection done from the abdominal aorta, at the origin. That's a possibility. But if we're considering whether or not we're going to report a 75625 instead, we don't have documentation that really supports that, because to report the abdominal aortogram code, you need findings for the abdominal aorta, and then the origins of the renal arteries, the SMA, the IMA, and also the celiac. And so we don't have documentation in this report to assign any imaging codes. So for that reason, I'm not going to report any diagnostic angiography, only because this report is deficient. Now, you could go back and query the physician and ask the physician, was the catheter in the superior mesenteric artery when the contrast was injected for the angiogram? And then if the answer to that question is yes, they should do an addendum to the report, make that modification, and then you could assign the 75726 for that imaging. And so then from there, the catheter goes into a distal branch. It says a distal SMA branch was selected. So now we're moving from the superior mesenteric artery, the first order, into a branch of the superior mesenteric artery. We don't know if it's a second order branch or third order branch. It doesn't say, but because we are going into a branch, we know we're at least at a second order. So this is going to make our catheterization code 36246 at this particular point in time because it was moved beyond the SMA into a branch. So SMA first order, branch is going to be second order. Then we see in the next statement that an expandable stent was placed across the stenosis of the superior mesenteric artery, and then a deployment balloon was inflated. So we have our stent with our angioplasty, which is going to be reported with code 37236. And then, of course, our completion angiogram is going to be bundled. So based on this documentation, I would assign 3 codes, the 76937 for the ultrasound guidance, the 36246 for the catheterization work, and the 37236 for the step placement. So again, I would go back and query the physician about the placement of the catheter to see whether or not I can report the 75726 because that code does require that the catheter be in the superior mesenteric artery. Okay, so let's go on to case number 2. So this is a pre-mapping procedure, pre-mapping for Y90 and Y90 embolization. And so the question that came in with this case is, can we code the 76380 and 76377 in this case? And then can you help explain coding for the pre-Y90 dosimetry analysis? So this report, the way that it's laid out, I don't like it when cases are documented this way because I personally find them more challenging to follow than a narrative. You see here that we start with the procedure summary, and then you get into like procedure details, and then you have, it broken down into access, sheath, laterality, vessel access. This to me is very hard to work your way through the progression like of the case when they're documented this way. And for me to try to walk you through and explain it using this, I just felt it would like take too long and we'd have to go back and forth. So what I did to assist with this case is I actually took all the information that was sent to me for this report, and I actually took the report text and dropped it into ChatGPT, and I had ChatGPT give me a procedure summary, a numbered list of all the steps that occurred, so I could actually follow it in sequence what happened and then make sure that I catch all of the codes that I need and that I don't miss any. So we're going to work off of this procedure summary to get the answers to the questions that were posed and then also the other codes that are associated with this case. So I've just done this to make it simple for discussion purposes. So I wouldn't have to keep scrolling up and down and back and forth and around and around. So we see with step number 3, conscious sedation, that is documented in the report. And so that was 80 minutes. So if you are in the facility setting, you are going to report all 80 minutes. If you're billing for pro fee, you're going to do the 99152. We do have documentation to support the ultrasound guided vascular access when that radial artery is accessed in step number 4. So we have the 76937, and then you'll see that, of course, I crossed out the 36140 for the non-selective catheterization, because once that catheter moves out of that radial artery and then it actually moves along the path to a selective catheterization, that is going to be bundled. So we see in step number 6 that there was selective celiac artery angiography. So that means that the catheter was in the celiac artery when the imaging occurred. And so we're going to report that with 75726. So at this point, we have a first order catheterization, but now the physician is going to move beyond the celiac and then go into the common hepatic artery and then do imaging of the common hepatic. So the common hepatic is a second order. So that 36245 gets bundled with that. But then when we go on to step number 8, the 36246 for the common hepatic is going to get bundled with the 36247 for the super selective left hepatic artery angiography, which is the 36247. But then when we go down to step 9, the physician is still moving the catheter even further, now going into the segment 4 hepatic artery, which is off of that left hepatic artery. So that ultimately is the final destination of the catheter. and that's 36247. So because that was a continuous path, there were no pullbacks and advancing into separate branches. We're only going to have one catheterization code, which is 36247 for that step number 9 there, and all the earlier catheterizations are bundled. Then along the way, though, we did have imaging. So we had the 75726 for the celiac imaging. And then for the common hepatic artery angiography, we'll get our add-on code 75774. We'll also get that for the super selective left hepatic artery angiography, 75774. And then we'll get it again for the segment 4 hepatic artery angiography. So we end up with the 3 75774s. And then step number 10, this is where we see the cone beam CT, perform with contrast, and then also 3D reconstructions on an independent workstation. So for this, I feel like this is a little bit of a gray area sometimes, and depending upon the case and like what's happening, sometimes I'll only report like the 3D rendering and not the cone beam CT. It depends upon the scenario. But here, because we're doing a mapping procedure, and all of the imaging is for that purpose, then I'm going to assign code 76380 for the cone beam CT. And then also the 3D reconstructions were performed to evaluate tumor vascular anatomy and confirm arterial supply. So there's a 76377 for that for this particular procedure. So to the person who sent in the case, the answer to the question is yes, I would code for both of those in addition to the other imaging codes. Then when we go down to step number 11, we see that a TriNav catheter was used for this procedure. So when a TriNav catheter is used, this is going to change the coding in the hospital setting. And what changes here, I'm going to scroll down so you can see at the bottom where I listed the codes for prophy and I listed the codes for hospital. When you use the TriNav catheter in the hospital setting to do this mapping procedure, instead of reporting the imaging codes, the 75726, the 75774, you're going to report the C8004, which is specifically for simulation mapping, and that's going to replace those diagnostic angiography codes. And then you're also going to report the C1982. That's for the TriNav catheter itself. You want to make sure that you capture that charge there. And then also in the facility setting, you can bill for the supply for the MAA that's injected. That's going to be A9540 for that. And so basically that is the mapping procedure, which ends with step 13 there. So again, the only difference between prophy and hospital is the simulation angiography. That's going to be coded differently. And then of course our mod sedation coding is going to be different for facility versus prophy. So part of the question was about the dosimetry planning. So in this particular report, so let me kind of start here. So whenever you're doing a mapping procedure, there are other procedures that you may be able to code in addition to the catheterization codes and the imaging codes. You may see the physician doing dosimetry planning. There might be some other type of treatment planning documented. There's also other imaging that is occurring outside of the interventional radiology suite, where you may have the ability to pick up additional codes based on the other services that your physician is rendering on the prophy side, or in the hospital side, there are additional codes. Now, on the hospital side, these other services, particularly if you look at the last bullet where it says transfer the patient to nuclear medicine, those charges are going to be coming probably out of the nuclear medicine department in the hospital off of their charge master. So the point is, the reason why I put these in here is it's possible to pick up other codes. So when the patient's transferred to nuclear medicine to do that imaging after they inject the MAA, then you have some codes that I've listed here for you that are possibilities depending upon what type of imaging that the patient had when they were sent to the nuclear medicine department to get that scan following the MAA injection. And then there's also another service or another code 78835. This is specific for SPECT CT, the 78835, when they do the lung shunt fraction calculation and it's with SPECT CT imaging, then you have this additional add-on code 78835. So that's a side note, that last bullet. That's not actually documented in this report, but this is just information when the patient gets transferred to nuclear medicine. Those are the coding possibilities when they go over to the nuclear medicine department. As far as additional services that are documented here, the only additional service that warrants separate coding would be the Y90 dosimetry planning. You can actually report that with code 77300. And then that's going to be reported with the professional fee and then also for the hospital as well. And I'm just going to do a little plug for my book, Cracking the IR Code, the 2026 edition. I actually did a separate chapter for 2026 on Y90 embolization. And so it goes through all of, the information that I just shared here on this case, and then it gives you all the different procedures that potentially could be coded when they're doing the mapping procedure before the actual Y90 procedure. And then it also gives you all the coding possibilities that you may be reporting during an actual Y90 procedure. So that was an area that really needed to be expanded to its own section, because that is probably the number one area for embolization where I get the most questions is about the Y90 procedures, and then what can I code and what can I not code for. And so it has a pretty good comprehensive summary there of the different components that possibly can be reported, and then also what you should be looking for in your documentation to report those codes. So if you haven't gotten a copy of Cracking the IR Code, I highly recommend you do. I know some people say, oh, halfway through the year, I don't want to, purchase, a new book. Well, we're not going to have very many coding changes this year, so I think you might be okay in case you didn't want to wait. So anyway, all right, so let's jump into case number 3. So this one is coming to me with the question about whether or not the diagnostic angiography should be coded. And then also, because there's abnormal anatomy, is there any additional catheter placements that should be coded? Okay. So this particular case, the CTA is where we're starting. So here on page 1 for case 3, we start with the CTA findings and impressions. So we're not yet into the interventional procedure yet. So I wanted to start here and highlight here because this patient has variant anatomy. And when I jumped into the procedure itself, the first time I looked at it, I'm like, okay, wait a second. I don't really have enough detail on this variant anatomy here. So I'm like, let me go back to the CTA. So the CTA here really tells us exactly what we have, because when I went to read the other report and I saw this mention of the sciatic artery, I was like, wait a second. I'm like, is that like a typo like in the report? Because I've not seen that before. And then I went back and I looked at the report and I'm like, oh no, this is like a legitimate variant. And then I actually looked it up because I was curious because I had never seen it in a case before. So this is a real thing and it's not an error in the case. And this patient actually has this variant anatomy on both sides, on the right and then also on the left. So in this situation, that sciatic artery variant is coming off of the right internal iliac and it connects to the right popliteal artery. And then the same thing is happening on the left side as well. So the patient has this abnormal anatomy on the right and on the left there. And then it also states in this CTA, cannot reliably determine patency of lower leg arteries due to extent of vascular calcification. So the question is that enough to code for the diagnostic angiography? So when I look at the report, honestly, what I would like to see over here in the report is a statement in the report itself about the medical necessity of the diagnostic angiography. That would be an ideal situation. Because when I come over here, I don't see anything in this report. Let's say I didn't have the CTA in front of me and I couldn't see it. There isn't anything in this report by itself that really supports the medical necessity for that imaging. So I would want to see better documentation in the operative report as to why the catheter-based angiogram was needed. And then of course it can be tied back to the CTA. So I feel like right now with coding the diagnostic imaging, that's going to be a gray area on this particular case. I did go ahead and list the code in this case, but I would consider it like gray area and I'd like to see better documentation for it. So when we get into this case here, just to keep it simple, because I don't want this episode to run really long. The last time I did 3 cases, I talked for almost 30 minutes and I couldn't believe I did. It went by so fast. So to kind of like keep this one like really short, going back to one of the questions that came in is there any additional, should we be coding any catheterization codes for this case? And when I look at this case, even though we have this abnormal anatomy, I'm going to say no, because the focus of this study was this left extremity, the lower part of the left extremity there, and there wasn't any other type of diagnostic imaging going on there. We're not evaluating multiple things. We're not evaluating multiple sites. The evaluation was to focus on this left extremity. And so that's what all of this kind of was leading to. So I personally wouldn't code anything extra for that. I would consider it all part of the intervention with that. And then also my question would be, looking at this report, is how is the catheter advanced in this procedure? Because the catheter goes into the distal abdominal aorta. We see the 36200, that's going to bundle too as well. I was kind of going through my thought process on that and I didn't like delete that. And then if you say the catheter goes into that abnormal anatomy, the sciatic artery, which is off of the internal iliac connecting to the popliteal, that it's like, did the physician go, through a vessel? Was there, a pullback and then, going, down an extremity? So we don't really know how the catheter was manipulated. That was kind of one of the questions that I had there that I would want clarified. But again, because we're talking about that intervention and then the imaging that occurs on the right, that's occurring, there, I don't see any catheter work being done over there associated with that. So anyway, back to what I initially said, I personally wouldn't code any additional catheterizations for this with the lower extremity revascularization. So as far as our final codes that we have for this, let me go back up here for a second. We have our sedation codes, again, depending upon prophy or facility, you're going to code for all of your units there. And then when we come down to our interventions, we actually have to go and look into the findings to see whether or not we have a complex or we have a straightforward lesion. And so when we look at the left perineal artery, it says it demonstrates a multifocal stenosis. So here we have a straightforward, but in that posterior tibial artery, it mentions that there's a focal occlusion in the mid portion. And then in the sentence below, it says, recanalization and angioplasty of the totally occluded areas. So we do have confirmation that is a total occlusion. So we're going to assign our 37282 is going to go for that posterior tibial artery complex lesion. And then our add-on code is going to be the 37281 for the angioplasty of the perineal artery, which is the straightforward lesion. And then again, for the imaging, 75716, I kind of have it there. Argument could also be made that if you were going to report it, that you may even do only a unilateral potentially, because this right side, if they're doing it on the way out, is it really diagnostic in nature? So we can say that versus 75716. Again, depending upon documentation. So the more conservative approach, if you are reporting diagnostic imaging, probably would be the unilateral. But again, I would get clarification on that. So you can see at the bottom, I've listed all of the codes that we pulled from that particular case. And this one has some gray areas like the other ones. Isn't that why we love coding and the challenge of it? So anyway, hopefully you found these helpful. Thank you to everyone who has sent in cases. I think I still have about 3 or 4 more in the queue yet to do. I'm actually going to be at a conference next week, so I probably won't be doing any social media posts as far as Wildcard Wednesday or any of the educational stuff. It'll probably be 2 more weeks before I do another episode. But if you have some cases in the meantime, feel free to send them in and I take them in the order that I receive them. Thank you so much for tuning in and have a great rest of your week.